On a pine-covered mountainside in Northern California, where the wind carries the scent of sap and forest earth, the Evergreen Wildlife Rescue Center quietly operated like a fortress within nature. Here, wounded creatures, eagles with broken wings, orphan deer, and sometimes even majestic predators, were cared for with the hope of one day returning to the wild. In a secluded enclosure at the end of a gravel path, a bobcat was recovering. Its copper-colored fur was streaked with black, its ears tipped in tufts, and its golden eyes glinted with an icy sharpness, traits that had led the staff to name him Ranger. He had been found 3 months earlier, caught in an illegal metal trap. The deep wound on his hind leg had nearly cost him his life. By the time he was brought to Evergreen, he was dehydrated, exhausted, and his eyes burned with pain. But even while teetering on the edge of life and death, Ranger never showed signs of submission. Throughout his treatment, he never hissed from fear, only from anger. As if he knew, born wild, he must die with the wild in his heart. "This one will definitely survive the re-release," said Dr. Clara Benson, the center's director, watching from a distance. At 59, with her silver hair tied neatly and glasses perpetually slipping down her nose, Clara wasn't easily swayed by sentimental displays from animals. "The only question is time." Not far from her office, Maya Tran, the night shift veterinarian, was answering calls when an emergency came in. A young girl reported finding a kitten barely alive beneath her porch. The local town clinic had turned them away, already overwhelmed, and the girl's father had driven straight to Evergreen in a last-ditch hope. 30 minutes later, Maya held in her hands a tiny creature, white as snowfall and trembling so hard it could barely breathe. The kitten, whom the girl had named Nimbus, hadn't fully opened its eyes. Its ears drooped like wilted petals, and its whole body was barely larger than Maya's hand. The fragile patient was in respiratory distress, severely hypothermic, and dangerously malnourished. The 13-year-old girl choked back tears. "Its mom's not around. I looked everywhere, but it was all alone." Maya didn't respond right away. She laid Nimbus on a warm towel, checked his heartbeat, and listened to his lungs, each wheeze heavy like a clogged machine. In that moment, Maya knew medicine could only go so far. The rest would depend on the kitten's will to live, if Nimbus had it. After administering fluids and activating the incubator, Maya filled out the new intake form. "Nimbus, kitten, approximately 3 weeks old. Condition critical." At the time, no one could have predicted that a wild bobcat at the end of the corridor and a sickly kitten in the treatment room would forever change the way they understood the boundary between instinct and emotion. That afternoon, as the sun touched the distant mountaintops, Evergreen Center quietly shifted into its night shift. The nocturnal birds began to stir in their enclosures, and the staff followed their usual routines, administering medications, checking enclosures, preparing formula for young animals. Lily Nguyen, an intern who had been at the center for 3 weeks, was tasked with moving Nimbus from the treatment room to a quiet area in the back, reserved for animals needing special care. Holding the small incubator in her left arm and gripping a tiny bottle of formula in her right, Lily walked gently, soothing the kitten curled up in a towel like a little fading cloud. She passed the row of predator enclosures, a strictly restricted zone where only trained personnel were allowed access. But the hallway shortcut was quicker, and Lily thought, "Just a few seconds won't hurt." As she walked past Ranger's enclosure, she expected nothing more than a wary glance. What happened instead nearly made her drop the incubator. From inside the enclosure, Ranger, usually curled atop a high wooden perch, suddenly sprang to his feet. Not in a pouncing or defensive move, but with urgency. His ears perked up, nose twitching, and amber eyes locked on Nimbus through the plastic wall of the incubator. Then, he made a low sound. Almost a purr. It wasn't a growl of threat, nor a hiss of warning. It was a ching sound, soft, rare, and more like the call a mother bobcat uses with her young. A vocalization rarely heard, reserved for moments of intimacy and care. Lily froze. She looked at Ranger, then down at Nimbus, who had just barely cracked open his eyes, breathing in fragile gasps. With a shaking voice, she radioed, "Dr. Clara! Jonah, someone, please come to the predator enclosures now. Ranger is reacting very strangely. Clara Benson and Jonah Reyes arrived within minutes. Clara, stern and grounded in reason, walked straight to Ranger's enclosure and observed. Jonah stood beside Lily, peering into the incubator. This isn't a predatory response, Clara said quietly. There's no crouch, no hunting stare. He's watching to protect. Jonah frowned. Maybe it's the scent. Nimbus might carry something familiar? A lost littermate, maybe? Clara didn't take her eyes off Ranger, who now lay pressed against the mesh wall, his chest flattened toward the spot nearest to where Nimbus was placed. We need to separate them immediately, Clara ordered. Whatever the cause, contact between wildlife and domestic animals isn't permitted under any biosecurity protocol. Lily gently lifted Nimbus and stepped away. But the moment the incubator began to move away, Ranger let out a short, sharp roar, and it wasn't one of anger or pain. For the first time since arriving at Evergreen, he didn't cry out from his wounded leg. He didn't growl in rage. He called. He called for Nimbus. That night, Clara sat alone in her office, turning the events over in her mind. She had witnessed countless strange reactions from wild animals: fear, fury, longing for the forest, even despair. But the urge to protect another creature, one not of its kind, not from its world, was something entirely new. And in a rare moment of uncertainty, the woman whose life was rooted in science found herself wondering. If instinct can be altered by a wound, can love be born from loss? Night fell swiftly and cold over the hills of Evergreen. The usual sounds of the forest, owl calls, wind whispering through the treetops, were replaced by a tense silence inside the rescue center. In the treatment room, Nimbus was fighting for every breath. The drip ran silently, his body temperature remained dangerously low despite the incubator being set to its highest warmth. The kitten's breathing grew shallower, interrupted, like an old clock winding down. Maya Tran and Clara Benson took turns watching over the incubator. On the monitor, the SpO2 readings fluctuated erratically, dipping, rising, then plummeting again. Even Clara, with all her experience, couldn't hide her sense of helplessness. We're losing this little one, Maya whispered, her eyes burning. We've done everything we can. Clara nodded gently. Medicine, even when thorough, could not always defeat the fragility that comes with being born too soon. At that moment, Lily pushed the door open, her face tight with concern. Ranger didn't eat his dinner. He's just been lying there, softly crying, not like a wild bobcat, but like mourning. Maya turned to Clara, her lips parting, then hesitating. Clara noticed. Say it. What are you thinking? Maya hesitated, then said what every logical part of her brain insisted was absurd. In neonatal treatment, contact with the mother's body, or a substitute, can improve respiration, heart rate, body temperature. Studies show this with monkeys, rabbits, puppies. Clara raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting placing a wild bobcat near a newborn kitten? Not with, Maya replied quickly. Near. In proximity. Completely separated. But if Ranger's reaction is genuine, if there's something in him that makes Nimbus feel safe, then maybe, just maybe, that could be what saves him. Clara was silent for a long time. Then she exhaled, her voice lower than usual. Set up the monitors. Don't take your eyes off them. Do it now, before it's too late. Midnight. A small incubator was placed just outside Ranger's enclosure, separated by a layer of shatterproof glass, 2 mesh fences, and a buffer zone. Maya adjusted the surveillance cameras, while Lily sat nearby, hand always near the emergency alarm. Ranger, as if expecting it, rushed to the barrier. But instead of growling or snarling, he lay down immediately, pressing his head to the mesh, his eyes fixed solely on Nimbus. And then, something no one dared hope for happened. Ranger began to gently vibrate, producing a low, rhythmic purr, a deep, steady sound, like a lullaby from one feline to another. Maya watched the screen. The data began to shift. Nimbus's heart rate, more stable. His breathing, less labored. Body temperature, a slight rise, the first in over 12 hours. By 3 a.m., Nimbus had managed to take in a small amount of milk via syringe, for the first time all day. He let out a tiny cry, soft, high-pitched, like a kitten calling for its mother. From the enclosure, Ranger lifted his head and answered with a quiet chirr, then lay back down, still keeping watch. At dawn, Clara entered the treatment room and found Maya asleep by the monitor, her head resting on her arm. Lily was still awake, her eyes ringed with exhaustion, but shining with something many had long since let go of: hope. "Our little guy is still fighting," Lily whispered. "And Ranger hasn't moved from that spot all night." Clara turned toward the Bobcat's enclosure. Ranger was still there. Motionless. Alert. But not to guard himself from the humans. He was watching over the fragile world beyond the fence, the tiny life he had somehow chosen to protect. 4 days had passed since the night Ranger lulled Nimbus through the metal mesh. Nimbus's condition improved more rapidly than anyone had expected. No more shivering from cold, now softly mewing for food, even managing to lift his head on his own inside the incubator. Once, when Lily brought a milk bottle close, he licked at it hungrily, as if he'd never been close to death. Medical charts showed a clear turning point. But one thing remained unchanged. Every time Nimbus was taken away for tests or moved from his spot near Ranger's enclosure, the Bobcat would growl, pace his cage, and scratch at the walls, only settling when the kitten returned. Word spread quickly through the Evergreen Center. In meetings, Ranger and Nimbus became a heated topic of debate among the staff and doctors. One Tuesday morning, Jonah Reyes entered the staff meeting room with a stack of reports. "Ranger meets all the physical requirements for release. Weight, wound healing speed, simulated hunting behavior, all within standard. We need to plan the release next week." Everyone nodded, except Maya. "You're planning to release a Bobcat who's displaying an unusual attachment to a domestic kitten and expect him to survive alone?" Jonah frowned. "Maya, this is a wildlife rescue center. We don't keep predators because of temporary emotions." Maya placed a printout of Nimbus's physiological data on the table. Heart rate, temperature, SpO2, all marked clearly at the point where his recovery began, the moment he was placed near Ranger. "This isn't a temporary emotion. It's a real biological bond, call it what you want, trauma imprinting, paternal instinct, post-loss response, but it's directly impacting the survival of both of them." Clara listened, saying nothing. Only when the room had gone silent did she finally speak, slowly. "The question isn't whether Ranger is ready to return to the wild. It's whether he still belongs there." That night, Clara sat alone, revisiting Ranger's intake file. A field report from the Rangers included one detail she had once overlooked. "Found the body of a female bobcat near the trap, likely killed by a large predator. Approximately 30 meters from Ranger." Clara froze. "That could have been his mate, or worse, she was carrying his cub," she whispered. Somehow, Ranger had lost his family, then was wounded, then caged. And now, a small, fragile creature had appeared just as the emotional wound had barely begun to close. 3 days later, Ranger's release plan was finalized. A specialized transport truck, a secure transfer crate, and a drop point in a national preserve 2 hours away were ready. But as the team prepared to sedate him, the unexpected happened. A familiar sound echoed from the back treatment room, where Nimbus was undergoing a final checkup. Though under the effects of the sedative, Ranger lurched upright. He growled weakly, head swaying, but still turned toward the sound. His eyes widened. His claws scraped at the cage walls as if trying to run. "He's fighting the drugs," Maya said, her voice trembling. Jonah, holding the 4 lines, sighed. "If we delay any longer, the sedative will wear off." Clara stood by the cage door. Her eyes didn't leave Ranger. "No," she said slowly. "We're not releasing him today." That same afternoon, Clara called Helena Brooks, director of Whisper Grove Sanctuary, a facility for wildlife that could no longer be returned to nature. After hearing the whole story, Helena simply said, I have space for both of them. A closed forest habitat, safe, natural. If that bobcat truly chose the kitten, maybe that's not something to correct, maybe it's something to protect. The conclusion to this chapter wasn't an action, but a decision. Ranger would not be returned to the wild. Nimbus would not be transferred to a domestic shelter. Instead, they would go, together. Not as planned, but exactly as the heart chose. 11 days later, a weathered but sturdy Ford Ranger pickup truck rumbled down the dirt road leading into Whisper Grove Sanctuary, a private reserve nestled deep within the ancient pine forests of western Oregon. The wind carried the scent of pine needles and resin through the open windows, nature's quiet welcome for two very special arrivals. Ranger, the wild bobcat, sat inside a specialized transport crate in the back, his eyes wide, calm but alert. Nimbus, now 6 weeks old, lay in a small incubator with a glass window, healthier, eating well, and meowing constantly. His high-pitched cries echoed nonstop inside the truck. And every time Nimbus cried, Ranger would lift his head, ears twitching toward the sound, answering with a soft "Grr," now a reflex as natural as breathing. Helena Brooks, director of the sanctuary, greeted them at the gate. At 64, with a deep voice and eyes sharp as a hawk's, Helena had worked on rescue projects for leopards, wolves, bobcats. She was no stranger to special cases. But even she admitted, after reading the file, she had never seen a case quite like this. Their new enclosure was a miniature forest nearly an acre wide, complete with trees, stone outcrops, dense shrubs, a shallow pond, and a network of underground dens. Helena had designed a transitional safety area. Nimbus would stay in a greenhouse-like chamber that connected to the forest via a one-way mesh door, which could be locked if needed. Ranger was released first. He silently explored, sniffed the surroundings, marked corners, then made his way to the spot closest to Nimbus, lying down, eyes fixed on the door. "He doesn't need time to adjust," Helena said to Maya and Clara, who had come along for the handover. "He's just waiting for his friend." After 24 hours of close observation, Helena opened the connecting door. Nimbus stepped out, hesitant for a moment, then sprinted straight to Ranger, as if it were the only safe place in the world. The team held their breath. Ranger lowered his head, sniffed, then gently licked Nimbus on the forehead, slow, deliberate, certain. "It's like he's saying, 'This is my territory. And now it's yours too,'" Maya whispered, her eyes misty. As the weeks passed, their new life began to take shape. Ranger trained in climbing and stalking through simulated enrichment games. Nimbus, now showing all the playful energy of a typical house kitten, ran wild, pounced on leaves, and always curled up against Ranger when the forest turned cold. Visitors to the sanctuary often lingered longer at enclosure number 6, not for the bobcat's imposing presence, but for the way his fierce amber gaze softened as he curled around a snowy white kitten, grooming him as if he were his own. "They don't ask what species is that anymore," Helena shared. "They ask how is he feeling." That's when I knew this story goes beyond science. Months later, Whisper Grove partnered with Evergreen to launch an educational program titled Beyond Instinct, Love Without Species, using the story of Ranger and Nimbus to raise public awareness about the consequences of illegal trapping and poaching, the psychological trauma suffered by wild animals, and most importantly, the potential for healing and connection beyond biological boundaries. The first image in the exhibit showed Ranger with one paw draped over Nimbus as they slept, sunlight filtering through the treetops above them like a whispered promise. "I once lost everything. And now, I won't lose anything else." 6 months later, a brown paper envelope arrived at the Evergreen Wildlife Rescue Center, its sender listed as Whisper Grove Sanctuary. Inside was a handmade photo album, soft leather cover, embossed with the words, "Ranger and Nimbus, a story that needed no shared species to be understood." Clara Benson turned each page slowly. Every photo captured a life no one had ever imagined, between an old-growth forest bobcat and a tiny domestic kitten. Ranger stretched across a flat rock, eyes half closed, Nimbus curled up between his massive front paws, both sniffing a branch of catnip, their eyes glinting with identical curiosity. Nimbus batting at a feather toy while Ranger stood nearby, not playing, but always watching. And finally, a full-page photo, Ranger grooming Nimbus's head while the kitten, eyes closed, leaned into his chest, as if loneliness had never existed. Clara said nothing. She handed the album to Jonah, Maya, and Lily. They fell silent. No one questioned whether the bond was real anymore. They just felt it. And understood, some things need no language. A letter from Helena. Along with the album came a handwritten letter, firm pen strokes from Helena Brooks. When I was young, I believed animals lived by instinct alone. After 40 years in this work, I believe the opposite. Because they aren't clouded by logic, they love more purely than humans ever could. Ranger didn't raise Nimbus out of instinct. He wasn't compelled to. He chose to stay, to protect, to remain, every day, even though the door to his enclosure was never locked. And Nimbus, instead of becoming a fragile house cat, is now the little prince of the forest, quick, independent, but always turning back to look for Ranger when he strays too far. Someone once asked me, "What do you call this? Friendship? Fatherhood? Empathy?" I just smiled and said, "It's compassion, the kind that lives in every species, as long as the heart still beats." A living legacy. The image of Ranger and Nimbus soon appeared on posters, conservation magazines, and in educational talks across schools in Oregon. On Evergreen's website, their story became the most read feature. Even skeptics found themselves saying, "I used to think animals only loved out of instinct. But after Ranger and Nimbus, I understand. Sometimes, the strongest instinct is simply staying beside someone who needs you." Final witness. One early winter morning, Clara visited Whisper Grove. As she approached enclosure number 6, Ranger stepped quietly out from behind the shrubs. Nimbus, now nearly fully grown, slipped out from a rock crevice and ran to him, nuzzling his chest like always. Clara didn't call out or interrupt. She just stood there, hands in her coat pockets, and whispered to herself. This isn't a story about a bobcat. Or a house cat. It's about the right to belong. About beings that know pain, and know how to find one another to heal. Conclusion: when definitions become unnecessary. In the human world, we try to define love through biology, psychology, evolutionary theory. But in that small forest in Oregon, between one wild bobcat and one domestic kitten, there was something that never had a name, but everyone who saw it could feel. And if someone were to ask, "Why does Ranger hold Nimbus every time he sleeps?" Helena would simply smile and reply, "Because that's how a wild heart loves, without words, without reason. Just knowing one small life needs to be kept safe in this vast, uncertain world."